They didn't just win battles, they erased kingdoms, they shattered empires. They redrew the map of the world in a single lifetime, from the walls of China to the forests of Europe. No army could stop them. No empire could resist them. They didn't just win, they won everything. And that's exactly why they collapsed. Because every victory made them weaker. Every conquest pulled them further apart. Until the greatest empire in history faced a problem no army could defeat, not invasion, not rebellion, but itself. Before we jump into today's story, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Follow me as we uncover the hidden battles, secrets, and legends of history that textbooks never tell you. Before they conquered the world, they were nothing. The Mongols did not begin as an empire. They were scattered tribes spread across the vast Mongolian steppe, a landscape as unforgiving as it was endless. Winters froze the land solid. Summers burned it dry. Survival wasn't guaranteed. It was negotiated, day by day. There were no cities here, no walls to hide behind, no permanent wealth to protect. Power was temporary, loyalty was fragile, and violence was constant. Tribes fought over grazing land, horses, and honor. Alliances shifted quickly. Betrayal was not shocking, it was expected. In this world, stability didn't exist. Only endurance did. And into this instability, a boy was born, Temujin, not into power, but into vulnerability. His father, a minor tribal leader, was poisoned by rivals when Temujin was still a child. Without him, protection vanished overnight. What followed was not a rise, it was a collapse. Temujin's family was abandoned by their own tribe, left behind as a burden, stripped of status, stripped of security. They were reduced to foraging, hunting small animals, eating roots just to survive. For a future empire builder, this was an unlikely beginning. But the steppe has a way of shaping people. Hardship wasn't an obstacle, it was training. Temujin learned early that survival depended on reading people, knowing when to trust, when to submit, and when to strike first. He learned that loyalty couldn't be inherited, it had to be earned or enforced. And perhaps most importantly, he learned what it meant to be powerless. That memory stayed with him, because in the political culture of the steppe, power wasn't centralized, it was negotiated through kinship, alliances, and personal reputation. Leaders didn't rule through institutions. They ruled through relationships, and those relationships could collapse overnight. Temujin understood this better than most, because he had lived through that collapse. As he grew older, he began to rebuild, slowly, carefully, not by claiming a throne, but by forming bonds, some through loyalty, some through necessity, some through calculated risk. He gathered followers not because of noble blood, but because of competence, because he delivered results, protection, victory, stability, things the steppe rarely offered. But this wasn't just survival anymore. It was something else, something more dangerous, because Temujin wasn't trying to restore the old system. He was learning how to replace it. And in a world where power was fragile, someone who understood its weaknesses could become unstoppable. What began as survival was quietly becoming control. He didn't build an army. He built something far more dangerous. On the steppe, power had always followed blood. Lineage determined rank. Nobility determined command. Loyalty was tied to family, not ability. It was a system built on tradition. And like most traditions, it was fragile. Temujin understood that weakness because he had suffered from it. When his father died, no noble bloodline protected him. No clan stepped in. The system simply discarded him. So when he began to rise, he didn't try to fit into that system, he broke it. Instead of rewarding ancestry, he rewarded competence. A shepherd could command warriors. A former enemy could become a trusted general. Loyalty was no longer inherited, it was earned, and more importantly, it was enforced. This wasn't just a social change, it was a political revolution. Temujin reorganized his followers into units of 10, 100, and 1,000, cutting across tribal lines. Old loyalties were deliberately dismantled. Men who once fought each other now depended on each other, not because they wanted to, but because the system made it necessary. It created something the steppe had never seen before, a unified command structure, flexible, disciplined, replaceable. If one leader fell, another stepped in immediately. No chaos, no hesitation, just continuity. And then, he changed how they fought. Speed became their greatest weapon. Every warrior trained to fight on horseback, often with multiple horses, allowing them to travel extraordinary distances without slowing down. They didn't march like traditional armies. They appeared, suddenly, unexpectedly. And by the time their enemies understood what was happening, it was already too late. But the real weapon wasn't speed, it was fear. Temujin's forces used information as carefully as they used arrows. They studied their enemies, identified weaknesses, spread rumors, exaggerated their own brutality. Sometimes they destroyed entire cities that resisted, not just to win, but to send a message. The next city would hear what happened and choose surrender instead. This was not chaos, it was calculated. Every victory made the next one easier, because often, the battle never had to happen. And as this system expanded, something changed. This was no longer a loose alliance of tribes, no longer a temporary coalition. It was becoming a machine, one that could move faster than any opponent, adapt faster than any defense, and break enemies before contact was even made. Temujin was no longer just a leader. He was becoming something else, a central force, holding everything together. And once that machine started moving, it became almost impossible to stop. At first, and it didn't feel dangerous, it felt inevitable. The early victories had been hard fought, careful, calculated. But now, something had changed. Northern China was the first major test. Not scattered tribes, not steppe rivals. A structured state, fortified cities, organized armies. The kind of enemy that should have slowed them down. Instead, it collapsed in stages. The Mongols adapted quickly, learning siege tactics from captured engineers. Walls that once meant safety became obstacles to solve. What couldn't be outrun was dismantled. Then came Central Asia, a region tied together by trade, wealth, and powerful cities. When the Khwarezmian Empire confronted the Mongols, it wasn't a minor conflict. It was a test between two systems of power. One centralized, bureaucratic, and confident. The other fast, flexible, and unfamiliar. The outcome was not balanced, it was decisive. After a diplomatic breakdown, recorded in Persian sources like Rashid al-Din, the Mongols responded with overwhelming force. Cities such as Bukhara and Samarkand fell, not all at once, but one after another, each fall sending a signal further ahead. Resistance had consequences, and those consequences traveled faster than the Mongol armies themselves. By the time news reached the next city, the decision had already been made: fight or surrender, and increasingly, they chose surrender. This is when something subtle began to shift. The Mongols were still fighting, but they weren't always being resisted. Some cities opened their gates immediately, others negotiated, some attempted to delay, only to discover that delay was not a strategy. The empire expanded rapidly across Persia, reaching into regions that had once felt distant from the steppe. And yet, the Mongols adapted again. Different climate, different terrain, different political systems. It didn't slow them. It didn't confuse them. They adjusted, and that adaptability became their greatest strength. Because most empires depended on consistency. One system, one structure, The Mongols did not. They absorbed what worked, discarded what didn't, and kept moving. By now, their reputation had become a weapon in itself. Stories spread across trade routes, carried by merchants, survivors, and refugees. Some accounts exaggerated, some were accurate. It didn't matter. The effect was the same. Fear arrived before the army, and fear made decisions faster than strategy ever could. At this point, victory no longer required equal effort. The system Temujin had built was no longer proving itself. It was accelerating. And with every conquest, it became easier to believe something dangerous, that this expansion had no limit. Winning had become routine, and routine can be dangerous. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, the empire did not fracture. It paused as tradition demanded, but it held together. Power passed to his successors, beginning with Kublai Khan, and the machine kept moving. The Mongols now had a fixed capital for the first time, Karakoram, a city built from nothing on the steppe. Walls rose, markets formed, diplomats arrived from distant lands. It was not a bureaucratic empire yet, but it was no longer just a wandering army. Still, authority still depended on leadership, presence, and momentum. And momentum was everything. So they kept expanding, not because they had to, but because stopping wasn't part of the system. Yet there were pauses. Genghis himself had halted campaigns after the Khwarezmian War to consolidate. Ogedei slowed operations after 1242. Logistics and leadership changes forced recalibration. The Mongols were not mindless. They knew when to breathe, but each pause was temporary, and each restart more ambitious. Campaigns pushed westward, deeper into lands that had never faced steppe warfare at this scale. Eastern Europe became the next frontier. Kingdoms there were structured, armored, and confident in their defenses. They had walls, fortresses, heavy cavalry, all the tools that had defined warfare for centuries. It didn't matter. In battles such as Legnica in 1241 and Mohi the same year, Mongol forces demonstrated something European armies had never fully encountered before: coordination at speed. They divided their forces across vast distances, then reunited them with precision. They withdrew deliberately, only to return at the exact moment of weakness. They didn't just outfight their enemies, they outmaneuvered them. To observers in Europe, the Mongols seemed unpredictable, almost unnatural. Reports described armies appearing where they shouldn't be, striking where defenses were weakest, vanishing before a counterattack could form, and then reappearing somewhere else entirely. Cities fell, armies collapsed, and panic spread faster than information. For a brief moment, it seemed like nothing could stop them. At its height, the Mongol Empire stretched across an unimaginable distance, from the Korean Peninsula, across northern China, through Central Asia, into Persia, and reaching the edges of Europe. It connected regions that had never been politically unified before, not gradually, but within a single lifetime. And yet, there was no final objective, no natural boundary that meant enough, only expansion as a habit, because the system they had built depended on it. Victory reinforced authority, expansion reinforced unity. Stopping risked something far more dangerous than war: stagnation. And so they continued, further, faster, deeper into unfamiliar territory. But beneath that expansion, a quieter pressure was building, because the larger the empire became, the harder it was to hold together, not yet visible, not yet understood, but already present, because an empire that can't stop growing eventually grows beyond control. If this story fascinates you, make sure to subscribe and check the playlist. There are more epic battles and hidden histories waiting to be discovered. The Mongols had defeated every external enemy, But they were about to face something far more difficult: distance. At its height, the Mongol Empire stretched across continents. But distance is not just geography, it is time. A message sent from Mongolia to Persia could take months. Orders delayed became irrelevant. Decisions made at the center arrived too late to matter. And in that gap, something began to change. Local commanders started making choices on their own. Not out of rebellion, but out of necessity, because the empire they were trying to govern was no longer one place. China required administration, taxation, infrastructure, civil governance. Persia required negotiation, existing elites, religious institutions, trade networks. The steppes required mobility, control through movement, not settlement. There was no single system that could manage all of this, and the Mongols had never built one. Their strength had always been speed, adaptation, flexibility. But those same strengths now made consistency impossible. In some regions, Mongol rulers adopted local systems. In others, they ruled through military authority. In others still, they relied on intermediaries. It worked, at least for a while. But beneath that flexibility, something was slipping. Unity had once come from shared purpose, conquest, movement, victory. Now, different regions had different priorities, different pressures, different realities. What mattered in northern China did not matter in the Persian heartlands. What worked in the steppes did not work in cities, and slowly, without a single moment of collapse, the empire began to feel less connected, not broken, not divided, just stretched. The communication system, relay stations, couriers, mounted messengers, tried to keep pace with the empire's size. Known as the Yam, it was one of the most advanced networks of its time. But even that had limits, because no system, no matter how efficient, can eliminate distance. And distance creates something dangerous: delay, misunderstanding, independence. Not declared, not intentional, but real. At first, it didn't look like a problem. The empire was still expanding, still functioning, still powerful, which made it easy to ignore. Because the most dangerous problems are the ones that don't look like problems yet. And by the time distance becomes visible, it's already too late to control it. The Mongols had mastered war against the world, but they had never solved one problem. Who rules when the war slows down? For all its power, the Mongol Empire lacked something essential: a fixed system of succession. There was tradition, yes. A great Khan would be chosen from the royal lineage of Genghis Khan. But tradition is not clarity, and clarity is what prevents conflict. When a great Khan died, the empire didn't immediately move forward. It paused. Leaders, generals, princes, they were expected to return, to gather, to decide. But the empire was no longer a single connected space. It stretched across continents, and that made every transition slower, more uncertain, more dangerous. Because in that pause, power was undefined. And when power is undefined, it becomes contested. Different branches of the royal family began to see themselves not just as participants, but as rightful rulers, each with their own armies, their own territories, their own interests. What had once been a shared expansion was becoming a competition, not openly, not at first, but beneath the surface. Tension was building. The political structure that had unified the Mongols was based on loyalty to a central figure, a single authority, a single direction. But now, that authority was temporary, and every time it disappeared, the unity weakened. Decisions that once came from the center now faced hesitation, disagreement, delay. Some leaders pushed for continued expansion, others focused on consolidating their own regions. Some prioritized stability, others still saw opportunity. And slowly, the direction of the empire began to fragment, not into open war, not yet, but into something quieter, more subtle: rivalries, distrust, competing visions of what the empire should become. Because conquering an empire requires unity, but sharing one requires something else entirely, something the Mongols had never needed before: agreement. And without it, the same strength that once drove them forward began to turn inward. Because when there's no clear path to power, power creates its own conflict. They didn't lose their empire in battle. They began to lose it by changing. For decades, the Mongols had been defined by movement. No fixed cities, no permanent institutions, no attachment to place. Power came from speed, from discipline, from the ability to move and strike without warning. But ruling an empire is not the same as conquering one. As the Mongols settled into the lands they had taken, they faced a new kind of challenge. Not how to win, but how to govern. And governance demands something war does not: stability. In China under Kublai Khan, the Mongols established the Yuan dynasty. They adopted imperial titles, built a capital, embraced administrative systems that had existed for centuries. It was a shift in identity, from steppe conquerors to emperors of a sedentary civilization. In Persia, the Ilkhanate moved in a different direction. Mongol rulers engaged with Persian political traditions, Islamic institutions, and local elites. They began to integrate, to adapt, to belong. In the western steppes, the Golden Horde ruled through existing structures, influencing but not fully replacing them. Each region evolved differently. Each ruler made different choices. And at first, this flexibility seemed like strength, because it allowed the Mongols to govern vast and diverse populations, to maintain control without constant warfare, to transition from destruction to administration. But beneath that adaptation, something deeper was shifting. The Mongols were no longer living the same way, no longer thinking the same way, no longer connected by the same identity. The culture that had once unified them, shared hardship, shared movement, shared purpose, was fading. In its place came something more complex, more local, more divided. In China, Mongol rulers became part of a rigid imperial system. In Persia, they became intertwined with Islamic governance. In other regions, they blended into existing hierarchies. They were still Mongol by lineage, but no longer by experience. And that difference mattered, because their power had never come from numbers or territory. It came from cohesion, from a shared way of life, a shared understanding of power, loyalty, and war. And now, that shared understanding was disappearing, not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. The speed that once defined them slowed. The discipline that once unified them became harder to maintain. The identity that once drove them forward began to fragment. And without that identity, the empire was no longer one force. It was becoming something else. Something less predictable, less unified, less unstoppable. Because the moment they stopped being the same people, they stopped being the same empire. For the first time, victory wasn't guaranteed. Up to this point, the Mongol Empire had followed a pattern: advance, adapt, overwhelm. Every new enemy had eventually become another victory. Different terrain didn't matter. Different tactics didn't matter. The outcome always felt the same, until it didn't. The campaigns against Japan were supposed to be another extension of that pattern. Kublai Khan demanded submission. When it didn't come, he sent fleets. But this was not the open steppe, not Central Asia, not northern China. This was the sea. The Mongols were not a naval power by tradition. Their strength had always been mobility on land, control of distance, speed across terrain. At sea, those advantages disappeared. The fleets, built with the help of conquered shipbuilders, carried thousands of soldiers across unfamiliar waters. The scale was enormous, the intention was clear, but control was not. Storms struck the fleets, powerful, sudden, and uncontrollable. Ships were scattered, broken, lost. The invasion collapsed not because of resistance alone, but because nature intervened. And for the first time, there was no way to adapt. But nature wasn't the only limit. In 1260, at Ain Jalut in Palestine, the Mamluks did what no army had done before. They met a Mongol field army and destroyed it, not through luck, not through betrayal, through strategy, discipline, and knowing exactly how the Mongols fought. The Mongol Empire had been defeated, not stalled, not delayed, defeated. Around the same period, Mongol campaigns pushed into Southeast Asia, regions like Jai Viet and Champa. Dense terrain, humid climate, unfamiliar conditions. The Mongols advanced as they always had, but the environment resisted them in ways armies could not. Supply lines stretched thin, disease spread. Local forces avoided direct confrontation. Instead, they disrupted, delayed, exhausted. The Mongols could win battles, but they couldn't control the conditions. And slowly, the campaign stalled. These weren't just unlucky breaks. They were patterns, revealing something the empire had never needed to face. Limits. Not every enemy would collapse. Not every terrain could be crossed. Not every battle could be won. For decades, the Mongol Empire had expanded without encountering a boundary it couldn't overcome. Now, there were places that resisted not through strength alone, but through complexity. And complexity is harder to defeat because it doesn't break, it absorbs, it adapts, just like the Mongols once had. But now, they were on the other side of that equation. The myth of inevitability began to weaken, quietly. Not because the empire was collapsing, but because for the first time, it could be stopped. And once that idea exists, it spreads. Because the moment victory is no longer certain, everything begins to change. Empires usually fall in fire. This one didn't. But that doesn't mean it never broke. The first crack was not slow, it was sudden. In 1259, Mongol Khan died. No clear successor, no peaceful transition. What followed was the Toluid Civil War, a brutal struggle between brothers Kublai and Arikboka for the throne. By 1264, Kublai had won, but the victory was hollow. The Golden Horde refused to accept him. The Chagatai Khanate chose its own path. The Ilkhanate acknowledged him in name only. The unified Mongol Empire, the single command structure that had conquered continents, was gone. In its place stood four Khanates, connected by origin, divided by reality, and they never came back together. What happened next wasn't collapse, it was something quieter. Across the vast territories, power no longer moved in a single direction. There was no unified command, no shared strategy, no central momentum. What once flowed outward now stayed local. In the western steppes, the Golden Horde operated with increasing independence, focused on its own political and economic interests, particularly control over trade routes and tribute systems in the Rus lands. In Persia, the Ilkhanate governed through its own administrative structure, navigating internal challenges, regional politics, and shifting alliances. In China, the Yuan dynasty ruled as a fully established imperial system, facing its own pressures. Economic strain, social tension, and governance over a vast, complex population. Each region still traced its legitimacy back to the legacy of Genghis Khan. But that connection was becoming symbolic, because in practice, they were no longer coordinating. Communication still existed. Diplomatic contact still happened, but it lacked authority. There was no longer a center strong enough to direct the whole. And without direction, there was no cohesion. This wasn't a second break, no declaration of separation, no formal ending, just gradual distance. Policies diverge, Priorities shifted, interests no longer aligned. In some cases, tensions between different Mongol rulers escalated into open conflict. Not constant, not universal, but enough to reveal a deeper truth. The unity that once defined the empire was gone, and without that unity, the idea of a single Mongol empire began to lose meaning. What remained were powerful states, connected by origin, but separated by reality, each adapting to its own pressures, each responding to its own challenges, each moving in its own direction. From the outside, the territory still appeared vast, still influential, still significant, but internally, they were no longer one system. They had become something else, not an empire, a legacy. And legacies don't collapse, they fade, because the most complete collapse is the one that doesn't look like collapse at all. The Mongols were never defeated by a single enemy. No empire rose strong enough to destroy the unified Mongol Empire in one war. No coalition of armies brought down the Great Khan's throne. No single battlefield ended their story. But that doesn't mean no threats existed. The Mamluks defeated them at Ain Jalut and kept defeating them. The Delhi Sultanate repelled invasion after invasion. And after 1260, the Mongol Khanates fought each other as often as any outsider. The threats were real. They just weren't what broke the empire. And that's what makes this story different. Because for most empires, the ending is obvious. An enemy appears. A war is lost. Power collapses. But not here. The Mongol Empire didn't fall to something greater. It faced something more complicated, its own success. Every conquest had expanded its borders, but also stretched its structure. Every victory had strengthened its reputation, but also weakened its cohesion. Because what held the empire together was never land, never cities, never institutions. It was movement, shared purpose, a constant direction outward, and once that direction slowed, everything underneath began to shift. Different regions needed different systems, different rulers made different choices, different priorities replaced a shared goal. There was no longer one empire, only multiple centers of power, each shaped by its own reality, and without a common purpose. There was nothing left to unify them. No external threat large enough to force reunion. No unfinished conquest that demanded shared sacrifice. No reason to move together. What had once been strength became distance. What had once been flexibility became fragmentation. What had once been unstoppable momentum became separation. And slowly, without a single decisive moment after the Civil War, the Mongol Empire ceased to exist as one, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too completely, because it reached a point no empire is designed to handle. The moment when there is nothing left to conquer that all agree matters. And in that moment, the question changes. How do we expand? What holds us together now? For the Mongols, there was no clear answer. And without that answer, the empire didn't collapse in one battle. It unraveled across decades. Because when victory removes every common enemy, it also removes the reason to remain united. Thanks for watching. Click subscribe and dive into this playlist next. More untold stories of empires, warriors, and history-changing battles are just a click away.